Bienvenidos. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning this webinar today. It's the top of the hour, so let's start. We are pleased to have you join us for the Mediterranean Collaborative Leadership Program webinar series. This program is framed within NOAA's international MPA capacity building and the tight cooperation with WWF Mediterranean. Our goal is to provide support and opportunities for the next generation of young marine professionals to learn from diverse individuals who have a wealth of experience connected to the world's oceans and their conservation. Today's and Tomorrow webinar is a continuation to the webinars already presented within our network in 2016. We have already tackled stakeholders groups as fishers, tourism, and oil industry. These webinars are offering a way to learn the experiences of different stakeholders in engagement processes direct from the horse's mouth. Now it's time to deal with MPA policies, so we are about to dive into 4 case studies to align us in a better understanding of the role that different stakeholders can play in order to engage policy makers. I'm David Cabana, a member of the Leadership Training Forum and recently PhD graduated at the National Kapodistrian University of Athens. I will be facilitating today's presentation from Galicia, Spain, together with Patricia Martí Puig from Galápagos, Ecuador. Hi, Patty, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Hi, everybody. Hello from Galápagos.
Okay. Hi, Patty. I'm going to keep introducing the organizers. So we have also Claire Fackler, a National Education Liaison for the NOAA Office of the National Marine Sanctuary sitting in California. I think she's not there now. And we have also Ann Walton, creator of the International MPA Capacity Building Program, sitting in Hawaii. Hello, Ann. I don't know if you can hear us.
Good morning from Hawaii.
Hi, hello. Okay, thank you for joining us. For those that don't know what this MMPA, WWF, and NOAA network is about, this webinar series was formally designed for the 24 members of the Leadership Training Forum. Those are a multicultural group with different experiences and roles. 10 members have recently completed their PhD researching in different aspects of Mediterranean MPAs, and the remaining members are working in several different projects and MPAs through the Med. In fact, so far, we have members from 9 countries within the Mediterranean and 2, let's say, alien species, Paula from Colombia and Katie from the UK. But today, for first time, we're pleased to broadcast for everyone out there with an internet connection and interest in this specific webinar. So welcome to everyone to this 2 days webinar series. For those that are not used to this kind of seminars online and to go to webinar platform, I'm going to introduce shortly the ground rules. So during the presentation, all attendees will be in listen mode. You are welcome to type questions for the presenter into the question box that is in here. The question box, you can write there your questions, and we will be monitoring incoming questions and forward them to the speakers after their presentation. To close the session, after the 2 panels scheduled for today, we will open a short discussion. At this moment, you can use the hands up icon, this one in here, the yellow with the green arrow, and we can unmute you. You will unmute yourself also, and you will be able to ask your questions to the speakers in real time. If your question is not replied during the session, this will be replied by email later on. We are already recording the session, and now Patricia is taking the lead and will introduce the speakers and the main goals for this webinar series. Patricia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. So now I'm going to explain the expected outcomes. The expected outcomes are a better understanding of the role that different stakeholders can play in order to engage policymakers, an understanding of the further approaches for improving relationships and promoting active and effective engagement between scientists and policymakers, the stakeholder engagement work behind different cultural, social, and political situations, an understanding of how to involve stakeholders in MPA planning and management, and finally, how to empower local communities to influence decision-making in marine protected areas. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our two speakers. Thank you both so much for taking the time to join us. Our first speaker is Kirsten Gould-Colbert. Kirsten is an assistant professor at Oregon State University and the director of the Science of Marine Research project. Kirsten actively works to bridge the gaps between scientific findings, policy, implementation, and public understanding of marine reserves. She's involved in both research studies and synthesis of the effects of marine reserves, which has led to peer-reviewed publications and outreach materials aimed at diverse audiences. Our second speaker is Pippa Helens. With 20 years of experience in facilitation, moderation, and conflict management, Pippa is an expert on governance of natural resources. She has co-authored the Manual on Participatory Processes for evaluating governance of protected areas with IUCN. For 6 years, she served as a facilitator during the creation of the Galapagos Islands Marine Reserve in Ecuador and its management plan. A participatory management structure was adopted, which was locked in through the Special Regime Law for the Galapagos Islands. In 2013, she founded Talking Transformation, which works internationally to facilitate change towards a sustainable, low-carbon, and climate-resilient world. I will now hand the floor to Kirsten, and she will share with us her experiences with publications and engagement. Please make sure you type your questions in the question box or to make a note of them for the open discussion that will follow the talks. Kirsten, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to the organizers of this webinar. I'm thrilled to be with you this morning. It's morning in Oregon, but I know it's evening for some of you. Today, I'm very happy to be with you talking about engaging stakeholders. I'd like to share with you some work on a project that's been going for more than a decade with the goal of engaging stakeholders by connecting them with scientific information about MPAs. So we know that there are increasing commitments to protect the ocean, including the Convention on Biological Diversity's AHG Target 11, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 14, and those call to protect at least 10% of coastal and marine areas by 2020. Now, last fall in Honolulu at the IUCN World Conservation Congress, the constituents took it one step further. Based on the science, their statement is that we need to protect 30% of coastal and marine areas by 2030. So the question is, with these increasing commitments, are we also beginning to see an increase in protection globally? So this is a graph from a paper that Jane Lubchenco and I published last year in Science. And what we're looking at here is years on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we're looking at the global area protected in marine protected areas. So you can see that, especially in the last decade, there's been quite an increase in the number of MPAs and the area that they protect. But we know that MPAs can encompass a range of different protection levels. Some may be weakly protected, some strongly, some fully. And so we wanted to look closely at strong protection and how that compared to protection overall. So I'll direct your attention here. We're looking at the percent of the ocean surface covered by MPAs, and the light blue color is all MPAs. The portion of that that is strongly protected is in dark blue. So what we see is that 15 years ago, less than 1% of the ocean was protected, and less than 0.1% of the ocean was strongly protected. There's been progress in the past 15 years, but at the time this paper was published in October of 2015, only 3.5% of the ocean was protected in any form of protection, and only 1.6% strongly protected. So obviously, there's a ways to go to meet that 10% target in the next 3 years. Now, when we think about establishing MPAs, it's not just increasing their number and size, but we want to make sure that they're effective at meeting their goals. And there are a number of papers that show, through research, what are some of the components that can lead an MPA to be effective. So, for example, this is a paper from Antonio DeFranco and his colleagues published last month. And here they were looking at the key attributes that influence how an MPA performs when the goal is to benefit small-scale fisheries. And through literature review and data, they showed 5 key components. The MPA should be highly enforced, have a management plan, fishermen as a primary stakeholder group should be engaged, and they should be represented on the MPA board, and sustainable fishing should be promoted, both in the multi-use zones of the MPA and in the areas outside. So I direct your attention to number 3, fishermen engagement, and that's what brings us all together today to talk about engaging stakeholders and what that means. So the Science of Marine Reserves project has a primary goal about engaging stakeholders. Our goal is to engage by sharing scientific information, sharing information that's relevant, that's useful, and that can help stakeholders and others make informed decisions about MPAs. So I want to start with the beginning of our project. At its start, which took place in California back in 1999. The Marine Life Protection Act was passed by the California State Legislature in 1999, and it provided a statewide mandate to establish a network of MPAs. Now, part of that mandate included that stakeholders be engaged in the process. Now, as stakeholders were faced with the challenge of discussing, planning, and implementing MPAs along with the California Department of Fish and Game, which was charged with enforcing and regulating, the stakeholders asked, is there any scientific information that can help us in our decision making? Is the science out there? If it is, what does it say? And at that point, there was no synthesis of the existing research on MPAs. And so that led to a working group that took place at NCEAS, which is the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis in Santa Barbara, California, in the US. And this group had the primary goal of reviewing all the peer-reviewed information, all the data, all the research about fully protected no-take marine reserves. There was broad representation in the working group, ecologists, social scientists, including economists, a number of different disciplines, including fisheries scientists, were represented, as well as key representatives of a few stakeholder groups and policymakers. The goal was to not only synthesize the existing science at that time between 1998 and 1999, but also ensure that the results would be relevant to management. So one of the outcomes of that working group was the first summary of marine reserve, and by that I mean no-take, fully protected areas, the science of these marine reserves for non-scientists. And this was a booklet called The Science of Marine Reserves. And the goal was to translate that scientific information, which we see so often just locked up in the peer-reviewed literature, filled with jargon, sometimes behind a paywall, so many cannot access that information. Instead, to present it in a way that was user-friendly for non-scientists. Now, as part of the process of reviewing the data and summarizing them, the group provided scientific guidelines that were then incorporated into the resulting MPA network in California. So this is the outcome of that Marine Life Protection Act initiative. And there were key scientific guidelines about bioregions that should be protected in MPAs, key habitats that should be protected but also replicated, the ideal size for MPAs as well as the ideal spacing between MPAs. And all of this information was presented in the Science of Marine Reserves booklet. So stakeholders reviewed it both by hearing from the scientific panel during the process, but also receiving materials like this where they could go and read the information on their own. So because the outcome led to something policy relevant, there began to be requests to do similar projects across a number of different regions. So individuals in Europe, in Latin America, and the Caribbean, and most recently in the Mediterranean asked, can we develop something similar with regionally useful information, case studies, and data that also pull from the globally relevant information about marine reserves and what their effects might be? So as a course of that, over the past decade, our project has evolved into an international scientific collaboration. There are more than 67 collaborators we've worked with very closely, as well as more than 200 reviewers around the world, representing 31 countries. And the goal is to research, synthesize, summarize, and share the effects of marine reserves and other types of MPAs. As part of that process, we've developed 5 different booklets, some of them in more than one language, for the US, Latin America, and the Caribbean, an international version, a European version, and most recently a Mediterranean version. And these present global information, but also with relevant case studies and data from each of these regions. As part of the process, we look through the breadth of literature that's available, the peer-reviewed literature about MPAs, and this is one of the first efforts to do that resulted in a meta-analysis published in 2009. So this shows the location of 124 marine reserves, which at the time had peer-reviewed published data available from them. We collated all those data, and one of the products was to look at what the ecological effects are across these reserves globally. What are the trends? What we found is that there are trends, and they are overwhelmingly positive. So here we're looking at the percent change on the y-axis in 4 different biological measures: biomass, density, individual organism size, and diversity. And what you can see by looking at these green bars that show the global average, overwhelmingly these ecological effects were positive, sometimes more than 5 times greater increases in biomass, for example. So the outcome of that was data showing trends that fully protected no-take areas provide ecological benefits. So today I want to focus on one of our recent areas that we've worked in, the Mediterranean Sea. And there are a number of fully protected MPAs in the Mediterranean. Fully protected, again, is the same as a marine reserve, a no-take area. And you'll see, first of all, working with our colleagues at MedPan, the Mediterranean Protected Areas Network, their MapAmed project produced this map that shows areas that are fully protected or multi-use MPAs that have a fully protected area in them. And you can see that the trend is definitely that there are more of these fully protected areas in the northern Mediterranean Sea. Most of these areas have data available from them. And so our charge was to summarize that data and see what the state of the science was for MPAs in the Med. So in so doing, we produced a new booklet, The Science of Marine Protected Areas, released last November. And in your list of handouts, the Sci of MPAs Med version is a PDF version of this booklet for you to look at after the webinar in more detail. But today I want to talk a little bit about the process and the products from that. So this process was highly collaborative with a number of close collaborators that you see pictured here. These individuals, as a team, we worked together to look at content that was relevant and useful for the region. A science and advisory committee was primarily focused on vetting and checking the scientific information from the peer-reviewed publications. many university professors from across the region. And the Policy and Management Advisory Committee was charged with making sure that what we were developing was relevant for decision makers, for stakeholders, and for managers of MPAs. Now, part of this involves a lot of time and deep discussion about how to communicate the science effectively, how to share the data, which data are most relevant, which case studies will be especially meaningful for people to know about. What is the way that we can take some terms that are highly scientific, very much jargon, and communicate them in a more clear way for non-scientists? What are the relevant findings, and what is the intended use, and how can we best serve the audiences that will be reading this information? So this shows some of those conversations, and this really involves a lot of investment and sometimes some hard decisions that may be a little surprising. For example, about scientific terms. When we talk about larvae, which are some of the youngest life stages of fishes and invertebrates in the ocean, it's actually a very sciencey term and not very useful for those who are non-scientists. So we had a lot of discussions about what was the most accurate way to communicate that. And we arrived at young or offspring instead of larvae. So just an example of these deep discussions. Now, after we developed a draft, too, it was very important that we be able to share that draft and get feedback on it to make sure that we're on the right track and that what we are developing is truly useful. So the draft content was reviewed by stakeholders, managers, policymakers, and scientists from across the Med and across the globe. And we're especially grateful to MedPan for partnering with us and making sure to connect with some of the MPA managers and get their feedback, as well as think about what's most useful for this group and others. One of the key pieces of feedback that we received here and even earlier as the science of MPAs has been evolving to include more of the human dimensions of MPAs and not just purely the ecological effects. So I want to show an example of one way that we did that in the booklet. This is a page from the booklet that talks about the long-term success of MPAs and acknowledges the very real challenge of short-term losses, particularly to stakeholders like fishermen when their fishing grounds are closed. And so this pulls from scientific information and the literature to talk about diverse strategies to reduce short-term costs, as well as rights-based fisheries management as one example of a stakeholder-focused way to provide benefits for all. Another case study that we talk about in the booklet is from the Taza Marine Park in Algeria. And I thought this would be especially relevant as it shows some of the tangible outcomes of engaging stakeholders in an MPA process. So here on the left, we're looking at data from this paper published last year, which shows the percentage of fishers in the community that were in favor of fishing control. And you can see there's a big difference between who supported the fishing control before they were involved in the process and after they were involved in the process. So there was a large increase in support after fishermen were at the table. Their voices and opinions and collective knowledge were brought into the planning process as well. A couple of other examples of the way that we've translated the science for general audiences. This is a graphic showing how habitats are connected even across the life of one fish, in this case the two-banded sea bream, and what that means. If the two-banded sea bream is a species of special interest for protection, then a portion of all these habitats should be protected. This graphic shows European sea bass and just how much more offspring of female European sea bass can produce. In the difference between 40 centimeters and 80 centimeters, an order of magnitude more young. So this is a compelling reason to protect older, larger fish inside MPAs, since they will produce more offspring over the long term. We also heard it was important to acknowledge that the size of the MPA has direct relevance for the species that will benefit from it. So here we're looking at a range of different sizes of fully protected areas, and the home range size of a number of different species. Now you can see, for example, for the dusky grouper here, the home range size of the adults is actually not very large. And so a fully protected area that's a kilometer squared, for example, can protect this individual during most of its life. Now, if we contrast that with bluefin tuna or the Mediterranean monk seal, we wouldn't expect a small, fully protected area to have any benefits for these species. In fact, fully protecting their home range is likely not feasible, as it requires an MPA of this size. But it's important to remember that this encompasses one stage of the life of the species and doesn't account for example, spawning migrations or how they move as larvae or young. So this provides some information about that then stakeholders and others can further discuss to determine appropriate sizes of a fully protected area. So one of the other outcomes of the project was to assess the progress of MPA coverage in the Mediterranean compared to the global scenario. So similar to the graphic we looked at towards the beginning, we're looking again at year, and here the percent coverage of MPAs in either the Mediterranean in the warm colors or globally. So first, I want to direct your attention to these here. So in gold, we're looking at the percent of the ocean that's protected in any type of MPA. So you can see this number has been slightly updated since the previous graph. So 3.72% of the ocean globally by the end of last year was protected. Now, in contrast, in the Mediterranean, which is in red, 6.5% of the Mediterranean Sea is protected. But remember, this is in any type of MPA. So for example, some of these larger MPAs have lower levels of protection, potentially enforcement issues. And so one of the ways to be able to contrast this with progress towards full protection is to look at those numbers. So now we're looking in purple at globally what percent of the ocean is fully protected in no-take areas, and in the lighter blue, in the Mediterranean, how much of that area is fully protected. So globally, we're at 1.44%. In the Mediterranean, less than 0.1%, at 0.04% is fully protected. Now, recently, the end of November, beginning of December, there was a forum of marine protected areas in Tangier, Morocco. And as part of that, there was a statement put out by the constituents called the Tangier Declaration. The Mediterranean booklet was released at this meeting, and this information shared about progress in the Mediterranean. And as part of the Tangier Declaration, constituents added this statement that the current coverage of 0.04% of the Mediterranean Sea should be increased to reach at least 2% of no-take zones. So this is an example how compiling the information and sharing it provided the opportunity for a policy recommendation, in this case, to increase full protection in the Mediterranean Sea. So scaling back up to our project at the global level, there are a number of other ways that the project informs policies by connecting stakeholders with this information. For example, the booklet is widely used by fishing organizations in Mexico that are making decisions about how to co-manage their resources. We also have colleagues like Carrie Sink in South Africa who use the information in the booklet and sometimes even use it to bring to the government when the government is considering de-gazetting existing MPAs, particularly fully protected ones. In Oregon's marine reserves, this information and the scientific guidelines in previous versions of the booklets were used in the discussions to establish marine reserves. And similarly in the UK, information about which species might benefit and learning from case studies presented in our European version of the booklet was part of the conversation about marine reserves in that region. So I'd like to point you to one last resource. We have a website where you can download PDF versions of the booklets. You can also find and link to the peer-reviewed publications that are cited in each booklet. Any of the graphics that I've shown today, as well as many others, can be downloaded and used for presentations or other educational outreach. And there's also more information about the project. So please visit this link to learn more. And I'd like to thank the many, many collaborators. Here are direct collaborators and co-authors on the booklet, again, representing more than 31 countries, and also our funding sources. So I'm happy to have been with you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Very interesting presentation and really important for communicating the science of marine protected areas to the stakeholders. So now it's time for the questions. I don't know if the audience have brought the questions. It's in the, we can give 1 minute for writing questions in case some people has. It's in the question box, so you can write in the question box. So, David, do we have some questions from the public?
Hello. Yes, so far I cannot see yet questions there. They should be aware that in the question box they can type their questions. I got a question myself, and thank you very much, Christine, for the very nice presentation. I want to ask you, as you presented the science of marine reserves, synthesize and shares scientific information about marine reserves and marine protected areas around the world. Do these publications have a focus stakeholder and a specific audience, like policymakers or researchers or any other kind of stakeholders? And the other part of the question is, how to say, does the project consider any other ways of publications, a part of publications, to make wider this information that the project collects about MPAs? These questions comes, for example, maybe fisheries or fishers or other stakeholders and citizens, maybe they don't have much access to these publications of the science of marine reserves. So is there any other format in of delivering this information from the project?
Yes, thank you, David. So the first question about specific stakeholders that this targets. From the beginning of the project, when the California process was underway, the deliberate decision was to create a resource that would have different levels of information that could be shared with different types of stakeholders. So, for example, the project produces a lot of the types of graphics that you saw in my presentation, which are aimed to be shared with stakeholders or others that may not know much about MPAs, be asking questions, want to see something visual. Each section of the booklet also includes summary talking points, and those were developed for policymakers, particularly for the staff, policy and decision makers, for example, who need very succinct summaries and things that they can bring to meetings, and those summary documents represent that. The other level of information is more in-depth text, and sometimes we've heard that's used in college classes or for stakeholders who want to learn more. And then there's also the list of peer-reviewed publications in the back, so often if other scientists use it, they go back and review that primary source of information. I will say that that was deliberate because for us, I sit in Oregon, I don't know the stakeholder groups in the Mediterranean, for example, who would be most interested in this information. And that's where our collaborators come in. Many of them collaborate with local fishing groups. They may be a manager of an MPA. And so our goal is to bring this information to them and then provide them with the resources so they then can develop other tools that are relevant.
Interesting. Thank you very much for replying. And I don't know, Patty, do you have any question for this? Because so far, we have a question from the audience. Let's see if I can open this question. Is Pauline and she's saying, "Hi, Kristen. By fully protected MPA, do you mean only no-take zones?" And then she say, "What it means? What I mean is, it does not necessarily include measures, limits, other anthropogenic impacts such as inappropriate scuba diving, boat anchoring, sustainable whale watching, etc."
Yes, so thank you for that question, Paulina. So fully protected by our definition means no take, so that means no extractive or destructive activities. So it doesn't necessarily include no access zones. These are areas where all entry is prohibited. And so fully protected, no take doesn't mean no access. Strongly protected means no commercial activity, perhaps some recreational or artisanal activity, but very closely regulated and very low impact.
Good. Okay, I hope I think it's
yes. Thank you very much. I think we can leave the following questions for the discussion part. So if you have more questions, we can discuss them later. So now I will hand the floor over to Pipa, and she will share with us her experience with the world behind the creation of the Galapagos MPA. Don't forget to write your questions.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we do, Piva. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, well, hello everybody, and thank you very much for this opportunity to share the experience from the Galapagos Marine Reserve in terms of a multi-stakeholder process to influence policy for the creation of the Galapagos Marine Reserve in 1998. And the presentation that I'm going to give is one that looks very, very closely at what Kasim was talking, the human side of this, which is how do you work with very, very different heterogeneous stakeholders in Galapagos at that time with lots of conflict, very different viewpoints. How do you get them around the table and agreeing to create a marine reserve that brings in restrictions on activities, as well as creating mutual benefits and co-benefits for everybody? And so this is the multi-stakeholder policy process for the Marine Reserve. A little photograph here of the fisherman's dock where you can see fish being brought in, the fisheries boats, but also the tourism. And this is a site where the tourists gather as well. So Galapagos, well known for both fisheries, tourism, and science. And what I'd like to say is tell you the story about the changes that happened. Oh, sorry. The changes that... Sorry, I just want to be able to move my own. There we go. Sorry, thank you. The changes that happened between 1996 and 1998. So on the left-hand side, what we have is the situation in 1996, where all of the rules around the marine area were considered alien, imposed, and inappropriate by multiple stakeholders. And there was a free-for-all for anybody who wanted to be doing tourism or fisheries, whether artisanal and industrial. There was a 15 nautical mile boundary within a biological reserve. Now, the biological reserve had been decreed in 1996. It was a terrestrial category which didn't allow any extractive use, that was being applied to a marine area 15 nautical miles from the coast where fisheries was happening. There was overfishing, there was shark finning, there were no zoning in place, tourism or fishery regulations in place, and there was an explosion of a sea cucumber, unregulated sea cucumber fishery directly after the collapse of that same fishery on the mainland of Ecuador. heterogeneous and fast-growing local population. We couldn't look back and say that there'd been decades and centuries of traditional use by community fishermen. These were recently populated islands, and so we're talking about fishermen, perhaps two generations of local fishermen, and serious industrial fishing threats to anybody who dared to say that there would be any change to their ability to fish within the marine reserve, and even for anybody who wanted to observe what they were doing within the Fisheries Marine Reserve. There were conflicts between the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Fisheries. Before 1996, this had been a fisheries reserve under the Subsecretary of Fisheries, and the Ministry of Environment and Forestry had come in to bring it under the National Protected Area category and create this biological reserve, but they had no category for marine reserves in all of Ecuador at that time. So they were using this biological reserve, and they'd snatched it from with underneath the nose of the Subsecretary of Fisheries. So there were huge conflicts at the interinstitutional level, and there were multiple conflicts within the islands between the different communities. A park guard had just been shot when he discovered an illegal sea cucumber camp. And things were really reaching breaking point when they tried to close the sea cucumber fisheries. There were strikes, demonstrations in the street. There was blockages of the Charles Darwin Research Station. So it was really a very, very difficult situation there, in which what they wanted to be able to do was to revise the management plan of this biological reserve. Let's jump to 1998. And in 1998, what is seen as a consensus-based local exclusive use rights regime for a participatory management system for now not a 15 nautical mile but a 40 nautical mile marine reserve. In 1998, 2 years after 96, it was decreed as a new national category of multiple use marine reserve. This was enshrined in the new national law, which was a special regime law for the Galapagos Islands. There was a participatory management system with consensus-based decision-making between the stakeholders and the National Park Authority and the national authorities. It now had this 40 nautical mile extension, making it the second largest marine reserve in the world. Industrial fishing was not only prohibited within the original 15 nautical miles, but was prohibited within the 40 nautical mile extension, which also included extremely rich seamounts, which are obviously very attractive for the longline fishing by the industrial fishermen. There were now exclusive artisanal fishing rights within those 40 nautical miles, and there were agreed management regulations within a management plan for all activities. So quite a change in those 2 years from one situation to the next. And I want to talk a little bit about how that came, and it's not all perfect what was there in 1998, but you can see the difference between these two situations. And really it was about the process and the approach to doing this. Originally, what was requested was a 3-day workshop to revise the management plan, which had been written in '92, and there were 2 months left of a 180-day period which had been given to revise this management plan so that it could be decreed as the biological reserve. And the National Park of Galapagos wanted to invite stakeholders to come to this 3-day workshop to review a draft management plan. That was eventually transformed into an 18-month, almost daily policy process involving different stakeholders, and most of those stakeholders sitting around a table. And for 9 months they sat around the table almost on a daily basis, ending up writing a whole section of the national law, changing the national forestry law and the protected area categories, drafting a new management plan, zoning system for a new category of multiple use marine reserve. And this point was when the director of the national park said that he wanted facilitation of that 3-day workshop. And when we said, that's impossible to review a management plan within the current situation and the conflicts that exist and the lack of trust and whatever within the different stakeholders, the answer was, well, that's all there is. because we've only got 2 months left. There are 3 weeks before that workshop to prepare the workshop, hold the workshop, write the management plan, and get it to the Minister of Environment for him to sign off on that, especially because there was pressure from the Subsecretary of Fisheries to sabotage this plan, so they had to have it finished within that 180-day period. So the only thing that we asked as facilitators was if during that workshop, after the preparatory steps we'd taken, there was a consensus that more time was needed, would that time be given? And the agreement was yes. If that was the resounding request at the end of the 3-day workshop, that more time was needed, then they would consider that. And that's how this very imperfect process was started, from the invitation to run a 3-day workshop. And the approaches that we used was a conflict lens. This was what was brought, not just a participatory, inviting all the stakeholders to a meeting, doing a stakeholder analysis and bringing them to the moment. We actually brought serious conflict lens to the problem, reframed the problem, applied participatory approaches and conflict management approaches to the meetings, looked at the governance situation, what was this situation in terms of decision making around that situation, and then there was a whole lobbying approach as well. And in terms of that conflict lens, Ted McDonald's a Harvard professor, and he was brought out by the Charles Darwin Research Station with support by USAID to come and do a conflict analysis just prior to this invitation to run the management plan meeting. And his report is fascinating, and I can share that with people if they want to see it as well. So it was somebody coming in, and he held 196 interviews with all the different stakeholders around Galapagos and provided this excellent analysis. It was then recommended that we would have professional third-party facilitation that would accompany the process. And we used participatory methods that I'll talk about, negotiation approaches, joint problem solving, and then finally consensus-based decision-making. And these were the rules of the game. So in terms of the conflict analysis, one of the conclusions by Ted McDonald is you have all of the technical, biological, scientific analysis of what is happening, all the fisheries analysis that's happening, fisheries biology, fisheries economics about what's happening within the marine reserve. But this was the other side. And attitudes, sentiments, interpretations, and interests are what are shaping the current conflicts. These are the truths that are held by everybody, and they will shape future conflicts. And there will always be conflicts around the marine reserve. So it's an appreciation of these different attitudes, sentiments, interpretations, and interests which is necessary in order for mutual understanding to redirect energies towards collaborative and other local approaches. There were unworkable patterns of local governance, so you couldn't just tweak this within a biological reserve status that's going to be controlled from the mainland. There was a structural inability to reach the sort of agreements necessary to manage the conflicts, structural power asymmetry, and therefore no local support possible for compliance and community self-monitoring. But there was one single most widely shared concern for islands that were 1,000 kilometers from the Ecuador mainland coast, and that was lack of participation. Very few other interests were shared at that moment apart from the common desire to have greater say over the way they lived and how things were managed in the islands, and also, yes, a desire for they all understood the value of Galapagos, both terrestrial and marine, and that there was a need to maintain this. But it was that key lack of participation, and that there were lots of problems and rejection of rules, but it was more the manner in which the rules were made against which they were fighting. So it was decided to reframe the problem, and this was quite challenging. This was interesting, saying something that you're now trying to put within some kind of protected area category, actually take a step back and say this is a free-for-all. The marine area is actually like a common property resource with the tragedy of the commons, with everybody using it freely and free riding. And so let's look at the common property. And Eleanor Ostrom in 1990 did her seminal piece of work around governance, which said these are the elements of success that any successful common property regime which has those free-for-all context, when it does work, they all share these characteristics. There's a well-defined and limited community. There are clearly defined boundary limits, locally defined management rules, locally developed institutions for decision-making that are accepted, legitimate and strong, and there are higher levels of nesting of authority which support local institutions, help to monitor and enforce compliance, and there is the right to exclude others from resource extraction and access. In 1996, none of those applied. So the reframing said, let's look at seeing if we can bring those within a reserve setting on the social side to be able to get to agreement about what happens with the resources, with the natural resources. But let's sort out this social and human and political side. So in terms of the facilitation, the third-party facilitation, bringing people in, we brought in two professional third-party facilitators. And the first thing was to work on this common ground. And the big change was, for the first time ever, a workshop didn't open with the authority giving the presentation of the history of the reserve, and this is what needs to be done. Here's the science, and now we're going to share this with you, and we're going to discuss, and you will react to what's being presented to you. For the first 3 months, no presentations like that were made. We did what we call an elicitive agenda, and what one of the fishery presidents said, it was like a blank page. So we had the previous management plan sections on the back of each page, and on the other side there was a blank page saying, now work on this side and say, what is it that you think should be happening around the marine reserve? What boundaries, which communities, which kind of rules, so that all can secure mutual benefits. This meant that before every meeting, we were looking at about 3 weeks preparation before we had a meeting that would probably be a week to 2 weeks long. And that preparation meant actually going to each of the stakeholder groups as well, within which there was also, they were very loosely connected, there was very little consolidation of each of these stakeholder groups themselves, so little trust within them. So it actually meant going and talking within them and helping the representatives of each of them understand what was about to happen in this meeting coming forward. So that investment before every meeting was necessary. We did participatory rural appraisal visualization exercises during the meetings. There was a pooling of both technical and local knowledge. So bringing the experiential knowledge and bringing the knowledge of what's happening and what's being seen every day while people are fishing, together with the Charles Darwin Research Station and the National Park technical and scientific knowledge as well. And many, many times those bodies of knowledge were contested. Either side contesting, and what we also found, and we decided that we said there was no, even within the science that came from the Charles Darwin Research Station, because much of what was presented as reports by the science gave, here's the data, here's the way we actually generated that data, and then here are the conclusions and here are the recommendations. And those conclusions and recommendations would be value-based. They would be value-driven for a particular objective, which was a conservation objective for the marine reserve. So one of the rules we agreed was we would bring the data to the table, but nobody would present a report with conclusions and recommendations as though these were objective truths, the conclusions and recommendations. The data was collected in a participatory manner, but what was then discussed, contested, and agreed upon were the conclusions and recommendations around that data. And that was a key building block as well. We did participatory mapping, we did a lot of interest and needs-based negotiation, and we trained all the members of that group who were national park, fishermen, tour operators, the Chamber of Tourism, the national guides, naturalist guides, Charles Darwin Research Stations, marine scientists. All of them received training in conflict management, in what it is to negotiate, so that they all had a common language about the tools that everyone was using, the tricks that everyone was using, and also how best to have mutually beneficial negotiation. And the one rule in the end was that every decision that was taken by this group would be by consensus. So many, many meetings. On the governance side, what was critical was being very early communities, so only a couple of generations really in the islands, no tradition within the islands, all coming from different parts of Ecuador and different countries as well, and being different sectors, tourism, fisheries, science, conservation, management, was to create the Grupo Núcleo. And the Grupo Núcleo was a group that was given a mandate and a representative mandate for each of those constituencies, and we had to work to build up each of those constituencies as well. And we worked on the representativity, the representation and the legitimacy of each of the members. And we did what I call re-entry. So when you bring everybody together and you have this amazing week and people start to see and open up and see things, put themselves in other people's shoes, start to see that there could be a mutually beneficial agreement here. But the minute they return to their island and to their particular fishery cooperative or to the Charles Darwin Research Station or to the tourism camera, all the other people who hadn't been in a whole week of meetings and discussion of the data looked at them and said, but we sent you there to achieve this, and you're coming back with something completely different. So, did they bribe you? Are you weak? And it was a kind of political suicide sometimes for the members to go back when we were talking about very, very big issues. For example, the prohibition of the industrial fishing in the whole of the reserve, which meant that a lot of the fisheries cooperatives that at that moment were selling directly to the industrial trawlers that came in, were selling shark fins, or they were just selling the fish they had because they're 1,000 kilometers from the coast, so they actually had somebody to trade with very close at hand. All of that was starting to change, and they wanted their representatives to be representing their partners. So what we did as the Grupo Núcleos, we move from sector to sector and island to island, taking those potential proposed agreements back to each base, and allowed anybody who felt that they were being pushed a little too much to push for an agreement because everyone thought, we're nearly there, come on, agree to this. If they really felt they were being pushed too much, we had a rule that they could call out and say, I need to consult. I need to be able to go back and come back to you again. And so we had rules around this, and we also had rules around opportunity costs. It costs money for people to leave their jobs and take part in these kind of meetings. So we did come up with a mechanism and a calculation of opportunity cost for some of the meeting times that people did, and the different gremios, the different sectors also contributed to those costs and had a very strict communication protocol of what was coming out of the meetings. Finally, in terms of the governance mapping, we had to make sure that whatever was happening, all this investment at the local level, 1,000 kilometers from the mainland where we've got inter-ministerial conflicts, and we have a new special law just being drafted, we had to make sure that whatever was being created locally was being supported, respected, recognized, and would be acknowledged by the higher authorities or other groups that could actually affect that decision. So this was critical. Often what happens is when we start with a bottom-up process, we don't do a critical enough governance mapping to make sure that somebody in another ministry or at a different higher level can actually just either negate this, reject this, or actually contradict it with another piece of legislation. So we did a huge amount of the mapping and made sure that this would be enshrined in the special regime for Galapagos. There had to be a change of the national protected system because we couldn't keep trying to just adjust to the categories that existed. So also within the new special law, the forestry law was changed to create the first ever multiple use marine category for Ecuador, so that Galapagos could have it. And alongside the creation of the marine reserve, the prohibition of the industrial fishing, the setting of regulations within the reserve went hand in hand constantly with the first issue that we worked on, which was the participation. The marine reserve would not have been created if it didn't go hand in hand constantly with that level of participation in decision making, which was then enshrined in law as the Junta de Manejo Participativa, which is the participatory management board, where all of those sectors had a seat at the decision making table consensus-based, and if they didn't reach consensus, there was the interministerial national level authority that would then take a decision. This was the only way we kept everybody all the way through constantly trusting and engaged in the process, that we could show step by step that this nesting and enshrining and that the participation went alongside whatever creation, whatever regulatory form, whatever zoning, whatever would go alongside with the level of participation. The final document that you may some people from Galapagos may recognize some faces here from 20 years ago, but this was word by word the final agreement of the management plan and the zoning. Now, as soon as the industrial fishermen who were invited to the first workshop that we had, they came to the first workshop, but they didn't come and they didn't answer any of the invitations for the following sessions of work. Their reply, as soon as they saw that there was an intention to limit their fishing areas and even prohibit them from certain areas of the marine reserve. At the beginning, there was no idea to completely prohibit them from the whole of the reserve, and the 40 nautical miles came later in the process as well. So when they heard about this, they said, we'll see you in Congress. They had their own political strategy ready. They knew that in Congress they'd have enough votes, they would have enough economic lobbying, they would be able to buy the Congress vote. And they knew that the special law was going to Congress, and that there they would annul anything that was happening locally. So locally, the lobbying strategy started with this consensus building that we had, meant that the two local politicians turned around, found there was consensus, and then fought to be able to be the ones who could represent that local consensus. Members of the Grupo Núcleo found a champion on national television, who then did a 2-weekly slot on what was happening with the marine reserve and this revolution in terms of this. There were presentations by the local fishermen and all members of the Grupo Núcleo to National Congress, and they went to visit the Environmental Commission. And it was important that it was all members, to show that all local stakeholders who had previously been striking in the streets were going to Congress and were lobbying and were presenting. And a policy brief was written, which was, why 40 nautical miles? Why move from 15 to 40? And why eliminate industrial fishing from that? And that was presented personally to the President of Ecuador. There was vote counting. There was a whole strategy and political lobbying strategy to see how many votes we could count on in Congress. It's not just a national interest, those are international support and campaigns. And when finally, in the special law, Congress approved a special law which created the Marine Reserve, they didn't quite nail it because of the industrial fishing lobby. So they said, we will create this new Galapagos Marine Reserve. And the management plan, which has to be prepared within 1 year to the date of the approval of the creation of Marine Reserve, that is where the lockdown around the size, that's the 40 nautical miles, and the prohibition of the industrial fishing will happen. And it will also, but the special law did say, this will be done through a participatory management system. So the next year of that 18 months was then spent creating the management plan. The last 3 weeks, there was incredible efforts to sabotage the management plan from the industrial fishing, but finally it was agreed by consensus, the management plan. So in 1999 it was locked down. And I just want to show, this is from 2016, and this is a map which we now have surveillance of the boats that are fishing. These are all the big fishing boats that are around Galapagos. So you can see the Galapagos Islands in the middle, and then around that you will see what we have there are the 40 nautical miles. Around that is the Admiralty's special zone, and then around that there's also the country's economic exclusive zone. And what you will see there is, before we had industrial fishing within, all the boats that are in the blue and green colours within are either tourism boats or cargo boats, or they're artisanal fishing boats. There is only one boat in red that you can see there, which is up towards the north of the island, which is illegally fishing within that. All the rest of the boats are fishing around the limits of the reserve, and they're fishing well. And these are one of the things that people are saying could be shown as some kind of evidence of the spillover effect, that they are actually still fishing around that, and it's still very rich waters around that 40-mile zone. Naturally, they take along fleets of smaller boats, which illegally they do send in within the reserve as well, but that's the next challenge that the authorities are going to take. So just some lovely pictures of the reason why we were doing all of that, but this was it. So I just wanted to give you a taste of when it's a complex situation and it's not enough just to call a meeting. It's really about how you prepare for that meeting. It doesn't always have to be 18 months, but often if you're doing something complex like zoning, it will be when interests are being affected, when the shared values are being affected. And it's about the lens and the science and the methodology that you bring to that. Not all of this that I've explained to you was planned from the very beginning, but it's bringing that kind of approaches that I think helped us to create the Galapagos Marine Reserve. Thanks very much.
Interesting presentation. It's very interesting to learn about all the long process of creating the Galapagos Marine Protected Area. In the meanwhile, David is selecting the questions of the audience. I would like to ask you some questions. So I saw like it's very important to involve the local community to this process, and especially the fishermen, and how nowadays. So what do you think will be the next steps to involve more the fishermen in their marine protected area and to communicate better with them and with the local community? Pippa?
Did you want to answer now that question?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, a very good question. That participatory management system continued for almost 18 years. In the new special law that was passed in 2015, that participatory management system was changed, and that, together with kind of a new sense of laws and regulations being imposed, and also I think a lack of credibility on many sides of the kinds of decisions that were being taken around fisheries management and tourism management, I would say, in recent years, followed by this new special law in 2015 that changed the participatory management system seemingly just to a consulting committee, has incensed many people, has infuriated them, and has created huge levels of resentment. I would say that it's almost like sort of starting again. It's once again there's huge levels of mistrust in some ways, and yet when work is done quite well. So recently, I think the Charles Darwin Research Station, together with the National Park, together with the fishermen, together with WW fisheries biology experts from WWF and CI, and also from the Governing Council of Galapagos, have just come up with the first ever 5-year fishing calendar, which has agreed what criteria would be used for each fishery, so that you don't get each year politically driven decision making. At least there is a consensus-based agreement around the criteria that should be used for a decision on fisheries, and also what's the status of the resource. Now, that's around the key fisheries that are already in there. You probably need to start including things like the white fishery. To be able to do that, I think once again you need to have that forum where you're actually sharing information, and you need to visit each of the islands as well. I think there's a real sense of centralization in one of the islands, and hold those discussions, but it's a joint problem-solving approach once again that's needed.
Thank you very much, Pippa.
And I think there's quite a bit of lack of trust. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Very nice presentation, Pippa. Thank you for explaining us all the complex work behind these negotiations and the lobbies and authority levels, all the fishers lobbies also behind, and very, very interesting process. I have some questions from the audience. We got also some questions for Kristin that we will hand later on, but we will keep with you now, Pippa, and I hope we can reply to some of our attendees now. So we have here Katie Hogg, and she's asking, since the final decision were made, have you had to adopt any of the regulations decided upon? How flexible or adaptive is the system to meet change? And if so, how do you maintain such a high level of participation to do so, given the commitment needed in terms of the time and money and etc.?
Hi, yeah, great. So I think those are fantastic questions. I'll start with the one about the high level, and I did sort of emphasize a bit. This was a very, very intensive process at the beginning because we were starting from such a difficult situation. We were starting from a situation of really sort of extreme conflict, lack of trust, interministerial conflicts, and heightened tensions because of the shooting of the park guard. So we were really looking at a very difficult situation. So to build up the relationships necessary to get where we did get, it was important to, you actually had to build up constituencies as well. Once those were built up and then enshrined in the management plan, then there were meetings were once a month, which were the participatory management board meetings, and they were one day, so one day a month meetings of that participatory management board. But there were rules about, to be able to make that happen, there was still facilitation to ensure that the preparation for that meeting happened and that people were communicating, consulting before they came to the... So this is the main thing, that people have really reviewed and consulted before coming to the meeting. So that was still happening, but the level of time was greatly reduced because the trust was there, because it was institutionalized in many ways. But obviously there are still conflicts, and what we said from the beginning, there will always be conflicts around multiple use marine reserve. It's just that you have a forum for managing them, and sometimes you might have to spend a bit more time managing certain ones. But so that was necessary very much at the beginning, and I would say any kind of creation of marine reserve or changing of the boundaries and limits, which would increase restrictions, would need an intensive period, perhaps not as much as that. In terms of the adoption, yes, a lot of what was decided was adopted. For example, the fisheries registry, and then after 3 years, a reduction of local artisanal fishing memberships, because it had been outdated, and many people who weren't actually really fishermen were there, who now had exclusive rights, but they weren't actually fishermen. The management rules, so the sea cucumber, there was a moratorium on fishing, and that was implemented, and then rules around the lobster. And then the zoning too, but perhaps I think with the zoning there was less perhaps monitoring and capacity to enforcement, and so the compliance levels around a lot of these little parts of the zoning perhaps was less than anybody would have liked. In terms of flexibility and it being adaptive to change, I think that's a real challenge. And one of the things we were saying was, how do we know what are the criteria for making a decision, and the ability to come back and say, what impact did that management tool and criteria have on socioeconomics, biological, and ecological. We didn't get to that. But in the 5-year fishing calendar that's just been approved this year, that does have within it a monitoring system that says, here are the criteria by which we will take a decision. Here have to be the different statuses of the resources, the status of the resources, to be able to decide what kind of management regulation is addressed. And we will come back at the end of the fishery and review to see if that was the right criteria to be using. That didn't happen during the early period. That was one of the missing pieces.
Thank you.
And so what then happened, when it didn't happen, if then there was the fishery wasn't as great, or there were problems with it, or there was still over exploitation, then you sort of had a blaming of the science, or a blaming of compliance, or a blaming of the other, rather than coming back and saying, let's really look about whether the actual management tool we used and the compliance tools we used were appropriate and fit for task. But that was the missing piece.
Thank you very much. We have here another question from another attendee, Sophia Natrus, and is asking if the experience of this project was used in another marine area in Ecuador, another marine protected area.
Yes, it was used in not exactly the same, because there weren't exactly the same conflict situations, but a similar approach was used in Calera San Francisco and also Parque Nacional Machalilla. Parque Nacional Machalilla had a terrestrial area and a tiny piece of coast, but what happened was then they were able to extend it into the marine area using this new multiple use marine category, and they created a participatory committee for that. Calera San Francisco was created as a bottom-up process through a similar process to this, where it was taken to the authorities with a consensus-based management plan to create it. The people who were involved in Calera San Francisco had been involved in the Galapagos situation.
Right. Okay, another question, and then we will pass to the discussion. We will try to interact a little bit with our audience. We have Pridel is asking you, Pipa, can you please provide an example of how the industrial fishing sector tried to sabotage the process and how this challenge was overcome in the final stage of the finalization of the special law?
Yeah. Threats, direct physical threats to fishermen, if they agreed to be part of this consensus. A lot of the industrial fishermen offered money for matriculation of children at school when the families needed, the fishing families needed. They provided loans to some of the fishermen, and then said that the payment would have to be that they didn't agree to this system. So you know that fishermen don't have access to credits from banks or whatever, so some of the credits came from the industrial fishermen. The industrial fishermen have a very powerful lobby. So in Manta, which is a big industrial, it's the big tuna capital of Ecuador, and Ecuador is one of the biggest tuna fisheries in South America. So they are huge, and so they used all of their political and economic lobby with Congress partners. Their problem was that they had absented themselves from the process and they didn't realize that it was as mature as it was, and that enough local constituency had been built around this. They thought that sort of the bullying and the threats, and they relied at the last moment to be able to use their political and economic lobbying strength. They took out adverts in the national press. Those were the kind of things that happened. In the end, it was the ability to get the votes in Congress, and it was a Congress political decision that in Galapagos, and this is where you'd get other iconic places. So if Galapagos being such a center for tourism, if there's unrest in Galapagos, that means that in the United States of America, for example, they will phone the Vice President of Ecuador to say, shall we put out an alert on our Foreign Office and visitors webpage saying, do not visit Galapagos, do not visit Ecuador because it's unsafe, or not? And if we've got, American visitors coming, sort that situation out. So that's kind of one of the contextual things as well, in that they wanted that unrest in Galapagos to finish, and when they saw that there was a consensus, that brought some of that political support as well.
Thank you very much, Pippa.
Thank you very much, Pippa.
Can I just say one other thing, that there are continuing conflicts with the artisanal fishermen, and there are issues nowadays kind of around long lines and things like that. But, I just want to make clear, we wouldn't have a 40 nautical mile multiple use marine reserve if the local artisanal fishermen hadn't decided to cut loose from their commercial ties with the industrial fishermen and join this consensus. And in fact, when the industrial fishermen threatened, it was the artisanal fishermen that went to the television first. So it's interesting, that we wouldn't have that fisheries reserve if it hadn't been for the artisanal fishermen, and of course having the consensus with everybody. But if that consensus had not included them, we wouldn't have the reserve we have today.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I would like to make another question that we have here. We have many questions. We will maybe send later on by email or try to reply now in the discussion session. But there is here, Elias is asking, what changes and challenges, if there are any, have there been when introducing new generations to the management of the MPA?
Yeah, brilliant question. I think one of the issues is the lack of intergenerational change. So I've just been recently back in Galapagos, and I've been working with them on the new zoning scheme and the creation of this new shark reserve that's just happened. The leaders of the fishing cooperatives that are there at the moment are almost all the same leaders. They've come around again as were there in 1998. And many of the younger generation and many of the sons and daughters of the fishermen are not turning to fishing. So that is an issue. Other people are interested in being in fisheries. Young people are interested in being in fisheries, but it's quite an interesting issue that around it, that it hasn't changed enough, which it should have done, in able to have that sort of that intergenerational change, and there will be a problem at some point because of that. In terms of the other is the new special law that in 2015 came out has created a huge issue, because it's actually stopped the current participatory management system while a new regime in a way is configured, and different authorities say, oh, just sort of refresh the participatory management system that was there, and others say, well, no, it wasn't really working as well, we need a new change, we need intergenerational change. But what's being commissioned is there has to be a new regulation created about what will be the management regime for the Galapagos Marine Reserve, and that regulation has to be written, and it's still waiting to be written at the moment. Meanwhile, what's happening are bilateral discussions between the national park and the different sectors around issues around the marine reserve, and that's a problem.
Thank you very much, Pippa. I think now it's time for the open discussion. So please, you can put your hands up if you have a question. So we'll unmute your mic, and allow you to interact with our speakers. If we don't get all your questions, feel free to send them, and we will try to answer them after the webinar. As a reminder, we will share the recording of this webinar. So if you want, Pippa and Kristen, you can share your webcam so we can see you in the discussion. There are also some questions from Kristen that they wrote before. So if the people want to say it out loud, they can. If not, we can also say it for them.
Yes, I'm gonna pass through the attendees, Patty, and to see if there is any raised hand. So far nobody, but we have a lot of questions for both of the speakers, for Kristen and for Pippa. So maybe you can start, Patty, to transfer the questions to our speakers today, and I will keep an eye on the attendees if they want to talk and to make the questions themselves. Okay.
Okay, so we have one from Sara Perquet. I think we didn't say that one. For Kirsten. Hi, Kirsten. You talk about the protection depending the movement, such as migration. Do you mean we should protect all the migration way or just important areas such as reproductive area?
Great. So, very good question, especially when talking about the size of MPAs. There's so many nuances that go into that and so many species-specific patterns. So, thinking back to that graphic that I showed that had the different sizes of MPAs and the different species and their home ranges. Home ranges give us a very useful way of thinking across averages. Where do they spend the most of their time? But the challenge is for species like groupers, for example, they often migrate to spawn. So it's important to remember that home range size alone isn't necessarily the only metric to use when talking about the best size of an MPA to meet the goals. But certainly spawning sites and even for widely ranging, highly mobile species, protecting key areas is a widely acknowledged, very useful way to use marine protected areas for some of these species. And that would include things like seamounts, where a lot of organisms go there to breed, to feed, and kind of similar areas.
Thank you very much. So just to remind the people, there is a hand in the attendees part. You have a hand, so you can click on it to talk. In the meanwhile, I will read the next question. David, do we have any hands? Let's see.
No, so far we don't have. I'm controlling, but no one so far. But there are several questions. If you can, you can read them. We can keep on replying the questions of the audience. Try to do that.
Okay, we have another question for Kristen from Sofiane Atrous. In the southern part of the Mediterranean Sea, there is a lot of lack of information concerning MPAs, but the fishing activities or the marine pollution is not that high. We have a lot of artisanal fishing. So a big part of the coastal is not used and the threat is low. My question is, can we consider this area a protected, the not used area? And when we set a target, when they set a target, do they take consideration the non-used part of the coastal?
So this is an excellent question, and returning to that layout of the MPAs and how so many of them are located in the northern part of the Mediterranean. But a very important point that uses and impacts are much lower in the southern part of the Mediterranean. So the first question is, can we consider these as MPAs? I think the challenge is that there's more than fishing that's threatening the Mediterranean and other areas of the ocean. And so it's important to remember that as well. There are benefits potentially for protecting areas and communities for resilience, for example, to climate change and other more wide-scale threats. Now, given the fact that that southern area is low impact and low use, I think the next step, it would be very interesting to be able to collect data from some of those sites and compare them to the areas up in the north, because that would be a really kind of specific and deliberate way to compare what the impacts might have been, and also opportunities or potential needs for protection. So I hope that something like that will happen, and our science advisors from those areas in Northern Africa and Southern Mediterranean were very useful in thinking about that in terms of impact and users and stakeholder groups.
Thank you very much. So, David, is any hands up at the moment? Yeah, we have. Now I see a hand.
No, maybe we will have.
I see a hand.
I cannot see.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, we have.
Okay, if you
Lina,
can give the floor to this person.
Okay, so we have Lina that I will connect. Unmute. Okay, so you can talk now. Lina, hello. Hello, Lina.
Hello.
You can talk. Yeah.
Thank you for these very interesting presentations. So my question is for Pippa. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
So regarding the next challenge of illegal fishing that you mentioned, I'm wondering if any actions are being implemented already or considered, and if any of these are participatory.
Thank you, Lina.
Yes, Lina, sorry, which do you say, which next challenge of illegal fishing?
So regarding the marine protected area in the Galapagos, in the end you showed that there is still a problem with illegal fishing, with boats fishing inside the protected area.
Okay,
so
good.
I'm wondering what actions are considered to foster compliance.
Yeah, wonderful. So that image, what that's showing, is one in a way which is trying to show quite a high level of success, which is showing that you actually have compliance by the bigger industrial boats, which are now ranged around the edge of the reserve. The reason why we can provide that map is because they are now required by law to have satellite devices on board, which means they are tracked. Of course, if they were, and these are all Ecuadorian registered boats, because no other country is allowed to fish within the Ecuadorian waters in that economic exclusive zone. So all of those we know would be, they may have other foreign investment, but those are Ecuadorian boats. When they're ranged around the outside, that's not illegal. What it's showing is that, you know, the overspill effect that everybody's trying to say, that, you know, if you protect an area, there will be overspill, and that will benefit fishermen from outside. Now, we don't want, so what that map is showing is that can happen, but as you say, within the marine reserve, at the time when that photograph was taken of that, there was one boat which was inside the marine reserve. And then this is a crucial issue for maintaining legitimacy of rules which are created especially by participatory approaches, is, as you say, what's the level of compliance and what happens when there's not compliance? Because otherwise then what we'll get is, why such effort to make a rule if somebody can break it and nothing happens? So the first steps happened is that we can actually monitor compliance. So what the Galapagos National Park and the Ecuadorian government, the Armada, the Navy has done is to require that all boats have those satellites, and the National Park has the capacity to monitor all boat action. Now that's just the big industrials. What's just happened is all artisanal fishermen now will also, in their smaller boats, they will also now have tracking devices. And so they will actually be able to see now whether they're respecting the zoning within the marine reserve, which up until now there's been little compliance around the zoning within the marine reserve. For the industrial fishing, only in 20 years nearly since the creation of the marine reserve, there has only 2 years ago been one successful case that's gone to court and has actually been sanctioned. That means they've actually ended up with the fine and in jail. There have been 3 or 4 other attempts where they've been captured, they've been brought into port, they've been imprisoned while they're waiting for it, but that's where the corruption and the economic lobbying and whatever happens, and the lack of ability to take a sanction all the way through that chain of the legal processes until you get sanctioned. So the fact that they finally have the first legal precedent, which happened, I think, just about 18 months ago, is very, very important. The fact that they can now monitor and track, and that they've shown that they can prosecute for the first time ever, is having a big impact now. Then it's down to the artisanal fishing within. There are regulations that are being agreed within the marine reserve in the zoning and around different types of gear and things like that. So around the zoning, now the artisanal boats will also be using, which in the end will mean a reduction of the effort that's needed over such a vast marine area. And with the push now to go to 30% and to create these huge marine areas, with a country like Ecuador and a place like Galapagos, which has very, very few resources to be able to manage such vast areas, that's a big problem about creating these big expanses. But with the technology of the tracking and monitoring, this is going to be something which will be a little bit easier to manage.
Thank you, Pippa. Indeed, very interesting what you were just saying. I don't know if we have any hands, anyone who wants to continue the discussion. David, do we have any? We have Sarah, just talk. Okay.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Thanks for
yeah.
Wonderful web seminar. I have a question for Pippa. Do you hear me?
Yes.
You talk about some illegal issue, like illegal fisheries, but do you have issue against the tourists, like when there is a lot of tourists and about the sound noise for the animals?
Yes, so in terms of the tourism, from the very beginning of the tourism in Galapagos, it was always marine-based, it was cruise-based, and in fact it's been sort of renowned as being one of the most tightly regulated marine tourism. That was in terms of ecological isolation between the islands, so there were very strict regulations about which islands could be visited, and complete washing down of shoes and any gear after stepping on board off one island, getting on board, going to another island. That was at the beginning of the days of tourism. With the growth of tourism and the growth of locally based tourism as well, and smaller boats, and an explosion of inter-island, now sort of island hopping by day tours and locally based tourism as well, there have been those kind of rules are no longer applying. And so yes, there is a raft of tourism things. One of the very interesting things, because of Galapagos being ecologically so isolated and its genetic and its evolution being one of the key things, an interesting one was around the use of lights. So all of these boats have the beautiful lights that are on all night, and during the night they sail from one island to the next, and it's all lovely and you're able to have all the comforts on board. But those lights attract insects, and the insects were being attracted to the lights on the boats and being transported from one island to another. Now these islands, the animals which are endemic on each of the islands have no defenses against predators, against pests, against anything. So once you have that type of transfer, the costs are huge, they're immense. Invasive alien species, one of the biggest threats to the Galapagos Islands, their ecological integrity. So a new rule came out saying that all boats had to change their lights, for example. There have been repeated efforts to agree on whether you cap tourism in terms of total numbers or you cap the number of boats. There is a moratorium on the number of boats, and in the latest special law that came out, a ruling was made that only one boat per family. Now, there are families that have more than one boat or have split up their concessions and licenses that they have. This ruling has come in saying that that is no longer possible and that they will have to hand in those. And what's happening now, instead of it being a right almost for life, those are now going to change to concessions. And the concessions will be 9-year-long concessions, and each new bid will actually include these ecological and management and regulatory criteria and conditions in terms of maintenance of the boats and kinds of what they do. that's just starting to happen now, and there's huge reaction from the tourism sector, who until now haven't really had to feel much type of regulation of their activities.
Thank you, thank you.
So it means if you want to bid again, you can't. You only get your boat for 9 years, and then when you want to bid again, you have to include all the new rules and regulations and conditions.
Okay,
thank you
very much, Pippa. Yes, we have the last question, and we will close this open session. It's from Anne Walton, and is for Kristen. And Anne is asking, the recommendation of the 30% marine reserves first came out in the AAAS meeting in '97, and soon became the first target on MPAs under CBD at Rio, then at the World Park Congress in Dublin, etc., etc. Quite some time after this, the first signs of marine reserves came out. Has this publication and the science become an important driver for creating new MPAs and reaching the IKI target?
Wait, we have to unmute you. Sorry. Yeah, now.
There I am.
Yes,
sorry.
now.
Sorry. I was saying, thanks, Anne. That's a really good point to raise too. That prior to last fall, when the statement came from the IUCN Conservation Congress, 30% is not a new number. That's a number that's been in discussion for many years, and that pulls from statements by researchers, from people who have been working in MPAs. Given the fact that because bioregions are distributed across the globe, and similar kind of to how things were planned in California, you need to have percentages of each of the bioregions if your goal is to protect overall global biodiversity. So 10% from the ecological perspective is not enough. 30% is more in the realm of what we would need to protect biodiversity and functional resilience for our oceans. So the question was also about how the booklet over time may or may not have led to, maybe continuing that conversation on and the creation of new MPAs. So I think that, like we saw in the graph that I showed, this increase in protection is definitely occurring, and being able to track that and show that is part of the reason that these new large MPAs are being established in order to be able to reach those targets. Now the challenge, and Pippa raised it so well, is that being able to actually enforce, much less implement these large-scale MPAs is a challenge because local capacity and resources are often low in these areas. A lot of the areas also, for example, from the United States, are in relatively remote areas. So areas that are very hard for individuals who are enforcing boots on the ground to get to and to patrol. So I think one way that I see our booklets and the broader science synthesis that they represent as being very important and relevant is to bring to the fore and continue the conversation about what is effective protection and how can we use all the technology at our disposal, the scientific information about what species are where and when, being able to take some scientific guidance when establishing these MPAs, I think is the next thing for us to look at and consider and remember how important those guidelines can be.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kirsten, and thank you very much, Pippa, for today. It was very good learning experience. We learned a lot in your talks. Now David will end up the webinar and introduce who will be the next speakers for tomorrow.
Yes, thank you, Patty, and thank you, Pippa and Kristen. We will forward the questions that we got and we couldn't reply today, and I hope you can find some time to reply to our attendees. We got some questions still for being replied. And yeah, our next webinar is tomorrow. and it's a continuation of what we have started today. Tomorrow we will have with us Stefan Hein and Angelo Villagomez. Stefan will introduce the job behind the negotiations for the Antarctic MPA agreement. And Angelo Villagomez will introduce the role played by the traditional Hawaiian community for the expansion and the creation of the largest MPA in the world. So yeah, don't miss tomorrow's session at the same time, at the same place. Now the session will be finished. We kindly ask you to take a few minutes and reply the questionnaire that may pop up in your screen, and hope to see you tomorrow. So thank you very much to everyone, and hasta mañana.
Hasta mañana.
Hasta mañana.
Bye.
Bye.